And I think, again, in many of today's academic rhetorics, the same falsity is discernible. And I think Chesterton is quite right to use here the strong term of blasphemy. The apparent modest relativization of one's own position is the mode of appearance of its very opposite, of privileging one's own position of enunciation. I think you make it very safe for you. It's the way of not risking an engagement. So, again, the lesson of all this is thus that there are basically two lessons. First, we should be very careful not to attribute to the other the naive belief we are unable to sustain. What do I mean by this? First, let me just emphasize how I think many of the terms which are part of the postmodern critical postcolonial studies doxa today are deeply not only Eurocentric, but are, how should I put it, are kind of a masked, aggressive, extremely aggressive Eurocentrism masked as its opposite. Let me take the fundamental category where you cannot miss if you want to be right today. Everybody's against essentialism and for contingency. No, contingency is good, essentialism is bad. But let's look closely how this category works. I claim that it is effectively a new, differently coded version of the old distinction between, primitives who believe firmly in their beliefs and we moderns who know about contingency, who have a more flexible intellectual approach, who live more reflexive lives and so on. Because if you look at it closely, the passage from fundamentalism or essentialism to contingency is always staged as a kind of a passage from more primitive, naive attitude towards more modern, plural, contingent attitude, whatever. So one should be, again, very suspicious about how this functions. For example, even in the case of the highest certainty, the notorious case of so-called media image, Muslim fundamentalist on a suicidal mission, we usually say, oh my God, but they have to believe. They really must believe. At least they believe. Well, frankly, I doubt if they really believe. I spoke with some of my Israeli friends who are, of course, Israeli in close contacts with Palestinians fighting Zionism, and they told me that they made some researches there and came to a strange, researches, okay, speaking with people who knew people and so on, and came to a strange, much more refined result that with most of these suicide so-called bombers, even if they pretend, even if it may appear that they really believe this story, which is often falsely appeared in the Western media, I will kill myself and tomorrow I will have the famous 50 virgins in paradise or what, that the logic is really different. The underlying logic is that they are terribly unsure of their belief. And the wager of their suicide is rather, I'm not sure if I believe, but by killing myself, I will, in a way, convince myself that I believe. So what I want to say is that even there is a kind of a doubt. And the counterpoint to this would have been that we in the West, precisely when we pretend not to believe, always the others are believers, we are cynical, we don't take things seriously. But I think that the structure, which was elaborated by some Lacanian theorists of the subject supposed to believe, how you need another one to believe for you, is widely practiced today. The classical examples. For example, I don't know, how when you say, I don't believe in Santa Claus, but I pretend to believe just on behalf of my children. But my God, do the children believe? Ask any child, he would say, of course not, I'm not stupid. I pretend to believe so that I get the presents, and so on and so on. And it's exactly the same with history. No? Do you know a wonderful book by Paul Vane, Did the Old Greeks Believe in Their Myths? And the answer is that, the best example of this ancient beliefs is, I think, a story about these Ethiopian Christians, who they believe that lion is a sacred animal. Because it's a sacred animal, it respects Sabbath, so it shouldn't attack their sheep on Saturday. But their logic is, we believe in it, but nonetheless, it's better not to take onto pasture your sheep. No, you never know. And so, again, how does belief function today? Let me evoke a strange example. You know that after the 20th or during even the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, the Khrushchev Report Congress. You know that there were even doctors back prepared to treat collapses, and it did happen. I think a couple of people had heart attack there on the spot. A couple of people died immediately afterwards, like Boleslav Bierut, the big Polish Stalinist leader, and a couple of people like Alexander Faddeev, the hardline Stalinist writer, president of Soviet Writers' Union, also killed himself a couple of days later. But wait a minute, was he a believer? It would be naive to accept that he was a believer. I mean, my God, he denounced dozens of persons. So he couldn't play the game of, oh my God, I thought we live in an ideal world, now I learned about horrible Stalinist crimes. No, it wasn't. He didn't learn basically anything new in Khrushchev's report. What was disturbed was only the surface. It was rendered public. That was the unbearable fact. Another example, which is, I think, the ultimate example of ethical hypocrisy, although it's usually in the history books that I read about the last months of German defeat in the first months of 45, it's evoked as an ethical example. The well-known example of a German mayor who, in the early 40s, there are two stories. One is from the West. The US Army occupied a small town and forced the mayor and others to visit the nearby concentration camp. And upon his return home, he committed suicide. The idea is, oh my God, you see, he was honest. Absolutely not. I think this was the ultimate hypocritical act. Why? My God, I'm sure he knew it. What he wasn't, the strategy of this suicide was to retroactively create the illusion that he was innocent, that he didn't know it. It's utter hypocrisy. The same with another ethical example that I learned. When Soviet army was approaching an East German city, a mayor also, he was supposed to be an honest Nazi. And in contrast to others who simply burned their documents, erased their traces, he proudly put on all the Nazi insignia and walked towards the Russians and was immediately shot. And the books that I read say, you see, this was an honest Nazi. My God, if he was so honest, what was he doing with Nazis, with all the insignia and so on? You know, so again, matters with belief are problematic. The last point that I want to make is that instead of conceding in advance any territory to the enemy in political struggle, one should struggle even for notions which appear naturally to belong to the enemy. What do I mean by this? Let me take, really at the end, an extreme case. I recently was reading Arnold Schoenberg's Harmonienlehre, you know, his major theoretical manifesto from 1911, where he develops his opposition to tonal music. But how does he do it? In the second part, he does it in terms which almost recall what we perceive as Nazi anti-Semitic rhetoric. He designates tonal music as diseased, degenerated world in need of a clear solution. The tonal system has given into inbreeding and incest. Romantic chords are cosmopolitan, hermaphroditic, and so on and so on. He even asks for some kind of apocalyptic act in order to clear the spiritual situation, and so on and so on.